Thank you and good evening. 2,500 years ago, Hippocrates came up with the word cancer. These were the three things that were state-of-the-art for treating cancer back in the day. Diet, leeches, and laxatives. Fast forward 2,500 years, and this gentleman, who is another medical pioneer, the chap with the hat, sells his incredible gene sequencing technology company to a major drug company, and but a few weeks later is diagnosed with glioblastoma. Not much has changed since Hippocrates' time. The average life expectancy is about 12 months. Stefan is his name, and he's kindly allowed me to share his story with you. He decided that medicine and science was going to take too long. He couldn't wait 4 or 5 years to try and crack this major problem. But seeing his brain and the tumor as an engineering challenge, he decided to surround himself not by oncologists, but by biomedical engineers, computer scientists, mathematicians, and physicists. I'm the guy in the middle there, looking a little bit like Bradley Cooper from The Hangover. I was a bit hungover. Honoured, really, to be his friend and to be surrounded by such brilliant people as you see in this picture. And really, that kind of group of people would be more suited, I think, to be working on engineering challenges like keeping this thing safe and efficient flying across the Atlantic. Shortly after seeing Stefan there in California, I took this airplane, which is a Boeing 777 extended range aircraft with two, for the geeks here, GE 90 155B jet engines. Bet you didn't know that. Okay, who did? This is the Engineering Society. God, if anyone says yes, I'd be very embarrassed. Each of these jet engines produces, in its transatlantic return voyage, approximately 0.5 terabyte of data. You're not allowed to look this up on your smartphones, but how many pages of A4 does it take to print out a 0.5 terabyte report? And yet that data is essential for keeping this thing flying safely on target to where it should go. Bit about me. I started off as an emergency medic. I trained in high altitude medicine. That's me, just before I fell. I survived. So I'm in the area of physiology, extreme conditions medicine. I spend half my time doing that and the other half of my time in California working with very clever bioengineers and computer scientists to try and help doctors make better, earlier decisions. My interest in technology began with this other spacecraft. This is the Starship Titanic. It was the most technologically advanced spaceship ever created, which crashed into your living room on its maiden voyage. And it was the brainchild of the late, great Douglas Adams. It was one of the computer games that he came up with. And I was privileged, whilst I was training at medical school, to work for Douglas on Starship Titanic, as well as The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy Online, the first Wikipedia. And I really was quite inspired by the man who 40 years ago predicted that all of us in our pockets would have the encyclopedia of life, the universe, and everything available to us, and really changed my view on how medicine would be practiced. If anyone's read the book, you might have remembered Deep Thought in The Hitchhiker's Guide, the supercomputer that was built by a pan-dimensional group of hyper-intelligent beings who decided that they were very bored about knowing everything there was to know. And so they decided to try and find the ultimate answer to life, the universe, and everything, and built Deep Thought, which 6.8 million years later came up with the answer of life, the universe, and everything, which is, it's wonderful being in an educated audience. You know, the younger lot just don't know the answers to things. Correct. Which does show the difference between information and wisdom, but that's another talk. However, what Deep Thought shows us is an example of how exponentially advancing technologies such as machine learning are rapidly changing the medical profession. 10 years ago, it was a mammoth international effort to try and sequence the human genome. Now, how much does it cost to do a full genome sequence? Does anyone know? About $1,000 for an exome. Yeah, about $2.5 for a full genome. It's pretty impressive. I got it done because I wanted new wallpaper. Nevertheless, it has made a lot of things that otherwise weren't possible because of the power of computing and our ability to digest data. So how has this kind of affected medicine? Well, in 1917, 100 years ago, we were still injecting tuberculosis into turtles to try and see if we could find cures. A few years after that, having made some advances in oncology, we were giving surgery, X-rays, and radium to everyone. And bear in mind that these are the only safe weapons against cancer. We've come a long way. Today, we're using supercomputers like Watson to help oncologists make better decisions than they ever have before, as well as beating everyone in the world at games like Jeopardy. But where will we be with all of this 100 years from now? Well, to answer that, I'm actually going to go back in time again to Hippocrates. In fact, before Hippocrates, to my favorite point in history. By the way, I was specifically asked to bring this next bit into the presentation. I shelved this a while back, but it's May the 4th. So you have the honor of being the last people to see this next slide. The person that really inspired me to understand where medical technology was going and how it was going to pave the path for the future was this gentleman. If anyone who doesn't know who this is, they can leave now. And this is why Darth Vader, for me, represents the future of bioengineering. He had 100% burns, massive internal organ problems, no arms and no legs, some psychological things, some minor issues. Don't laugh, this is patient stuff, you know, people suffer with these things. And of course, and yet Mr. Vader was able to run the galaxy and enjoy life to the full, thanks to a plethora of biosensors, physiological monitoring, machine learning, and various other things. But it wasn't Darth Vader, in fact, that was my true inspiration. It was his line manager, Emperor Palpatine, who is played by the really brilliant actor Ian McDermott, who is publicly known to have had a heart attack on stage back in 2008, and his manager, said, "Look, it's really, really important. You guys do lots of stuff with monitoring and elite athletes and Formula One drivers. Can you please tell me when he's going to have another heart attack so we can avoid it?" I thought, well, actually, maybe it is possible. Maybe we could hook him up with all the stuff we do with F1 drivers and their hearts and stuff. So it got me thinking. Just as a quick aside, this is the most important text message I ever received. It was from Ian himself, where he wished me a happy Christmas and hoped my Jedi instincts were still intact, which is a pivotal moment in my life when I became the Imperial Physician, which I'm very proud about. But I don't actually work on the Death Star. I work at my institute in London, the Centre for Health and Human Performance. We're a team of 40 scientists and specialists, and essentially we apply human performance science to help very sick people get better outcomes. We look at measure people's physiology in real time. This is our modern equipment. We also work with a lot of athletes, obviously. This is Anthony Joshua applying a new Ukrainian headache treatment to his opponent on Saturday. We also work with all the comic relief and sport relief folk who, like Eddie Izzard here, running his 43 marathons in 50 days, and Dave Walliams swimming the channel there. And they also get me to do silly things like get thrown in cage fights for science to see whether rest, ice, compression, and elevation really work. It's true. But we do serious stuff too. We take our stuff up to Everest to find out what happens to bodies in extremis so that we can help people who are in critical conditions, neonates, people in ICU. And we also help cancer patients. We optimize their physiology so that they can survive cancer treatment and enjoy a better quality of life and longer survivorship. And we are able to do this by taking an engineering approach to the problem. We measure lots of stuff, more stuff than most doctors could possibly digest. And with those data, we are able to accurately predict the decline in people's physiology over time, to be able to accurately even tell when people are going to die, notwithstanding injury or other things. Good news is we can shift people and optimize them. So it's not all predicting the future, it's about how you can improve to get the most. But we're a boutique, we're a tiny little institute. How can we possibly deliver this to all people? Well, I was lucky enough in 2012 to be invited to a great place in California called Singularity University, where I suddenly started hearing about these things called wearables and realizing that a lot of the physiological data we could get from simple, cheap connected devices and not necessarily the expensive kit in our lab. And this includes things like this Vital Connect patch. It's a tiny little thing. It looks like a sticky plaster. And it measures all sorts of wonderful stuff, like your heart rate and your breathing and your movement. And we decided to do some fun stuff with it too. This is another comic relief challenge with Alan Shearer there and Robbie Savage sitting on every seat in Wembley Stadium to see who could get round first. And we used this physiological monitoring technology to be able to predict, looking at their physiological stress, which one was going to be more efficient and actually get round the seats first. But there are serious applications of such technology, and this technology is extraordinary because due to all this brilliant engineering effort, the price is coming down and down and down, such that something like this that we would have stuck on a Formula One driver 10 years ago that would cost tens of thousands of dollars now would cost about $1 a day in order to early predict when somebody was going to come crashing into hospital with congestive heart failure or with COPD. This is me peeling that sticker off, and Shearer, he won. So thinking about things from an engineering perspective, we started to scribble down whether or not we could emulate the kind of processes going in our head, the intuitions as doctors to early predict from such technologies whether or not people were going to get sick, frequent flyers into hospital, really chronically sick people, people who had no white cells because they were getting chemotherapy, etc. And so we built some maths, and some software on top of that maths to early predict 5 days in advance of even symptoms, whether people were going to come into hospital or not, so we could act early. And it's very, very much like what we do with jet engines, with aircraft, with any critical machinery. This is the G90-115B jet engine. Does anyone know how many pages it takes to print out print out a 0.5 terabyte report? Gave it away. It's 100 million pages. That's how many pages it takes. And that's a lot to read in a ward round. So why is it that we can't take those kinds of data streams and the kind of intelligence that is analyzed by machines to help us better earlier detect failures and deficiencies so that we can better fly ourselves through our lives? This was the state of the art when I was born. Height and weight charts to predict if things were going wrong just once a year. I ask you, would you get in an airplane that hadn't been checked for half a century? It takes us 50 years to start measuring stuff about ourselves, and we are the most precious machines that we know. It makes healthcare a dangerous thing. High reliability organizations like scheduled airlines are incredibly safe. Up here in healthcare, we're more dangerous than mountaineering, my own personal pastime. And it also doesn't only make it dangerous, it also makes it a problem for affordability because we make so many mistakes and we accumulate so many problems in our bodies before we treat them. We have a healthcare crisis. Not only do we have a healthcare crisis, we also have a pinch, more than a pinch, in our budgets. We have to save incredible amounts in order to make healthcare affordable, and yet the burden of disease is increasing. Most pundits regard the efficiency savings we need to make in healthcare in this country as an undoable problem. Even places like Denmark are projected to spend incredibly huge amounts of money in their healthcare budgets. They are the most efficient healthcare system in the world. Look at America at the bottom. Our projected healthcare costs are plummeting, are spiraling out of control. And if we do not take an engineering approach to some of these problems, we are doomed to financial consequences. Many people don't know that even today, our current pension requirement is 4 times the national debt. That's only set to increase. When I was born, the average life expectancy of a man in this country was 69 years. It's now 84. But are we actually increasing the amount of years where we can work and have energy and are disease-free? The things that we accumulate now, having been held together by pharmacology alone, we are seeing a great deal of heart failure, chronic lung diseases like COPD and asthma, complex issues associated with diabetes, neurodegeneration, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and of course, cancer. These 5 problems account for 73% of the healthcare costs in the Western world, and they're only set to increase. Engineers have started looking at this from a fundamental basis, beyond prevention, beyond what we can do when our bodies can still heal themselves. The fundamental basis for how disease develops. If you want to read about it, there's a fantastic article in a 2003 Cell issue called The 9 Hallmarks of Aging. I strongly recommend you read it. But this is now starting to take a fundamental mechanistic approach to what's going on inside our cells to try and understand how we can target and improve the length of time that we have got before we end up accumulating these complex chronic diseases. We have to do this because without taking such an engineering approach, we will never close the gap between health span and lifespan. This brilliant woman here called Mel is looking after my brother. My brother has multiple sclerosis. He's had it since the age of 30. So for more than half of his life, he's been unable to work and thrive. Today, on average, we have 20% of our lives where we can no longer enjoy the fullness of health. If we are going to survive as industry moves us this way into our hundreds, my prediction is that the gap between health span and lifespan is only going to increase to 25% if we're lucky, unless we fundamentally address the problem at its root mechanistic cause. We need to be able to thrive until we're 100, not just survive. We need to make 100 of those 100 years effective. We need to have the energy, the capacity, the motivation to carry our grandchildren on our shoulders, not just to be in existence and watch TV, or watch people like me. That wouldn't be too bad. And this is not vanity. Longevity is very, very important, but it's a necessity that it's effective, healthy longevity. And it's also got to be affordable. We can't tackle these trillion-dollar problems without fundamentally revisiting how we address these complex chronic diseases. And it's got to be accessible to all. We cannot split ourselves from being the lucky few who can afford brilliant medicine and live for a very long time healthily without making this something that is accessible to all the people that are going to present this economic burden to us. It's got to be available not just to billionaires, but to the billions. The only way we can achieve this is with scale, and that's what engineering is brilliant for. We take the science, we apply engineering, we can scale things, we can mass manufacture them, we can make it accessible to many people. We can also treat things earlier and prevent them, but there's a limit to prevention. Eventually, some of us will get some of these problems and have to treat them. In 100 years, or even I hope much closer than that, the future will look a bit like this. Cancer will be treated just like all the complex chronic diseases with science, as we have today. But with engineering underpinning all of those efforts, and fundamentally as well, to ensure that we have accessibility and equity in our health system with compassion, that we don't just invent things that are available to the lucky few. Thank you. Just before I go, have I got a tiny bit of time? 1 minute. Just want to share a little personal story. So Stefan, who I mentioned, who's in this picture here, so he was diagnosed not so long ago, pretty recently, about 6 weeks ago, with glioblastoma. A week ago, someone who knows Stefan referred another person to me. Not that I'm an oncologist, we just work with a lot of brilliant people, who also was diagnosed with glioblastoma. That person was unfortunately unable to gain access to the kinds of engineering minds that surround Stefan. And really, one of the reasons I made that picture black and white is because Stefan's outcomes and this other person's outcomes really are the difference between night and day. It's most likely that the average person today, if any of us are unlucky in the room to know someone or to get glioblastoma or one of these other very aggressive cancers ourselves, will probably live for about 250,000 minutes. That's maybe 10 months. However, with the right access to engineering, taking a methodical approach to having a hypothesis, designing an intervention, iteratively testing whether that's working, and then pivoting or persisting, as you would in any engineering project, you can make a fundamentally profound difference to the outcomes. And our own projections so far, that with the access that Stefan has, that he will probably live for over 10 million minutes, which is way in excess of what people are expected to live for today. And the only difference is access. The only difference is that he has introduced engineering into medicine. And I believe that's something that we all have a responsibility to do, both in medicine and in the wider world. Thank you. I was just the warm-up act. It gives me enormous pleasure to introduce someone who is at the cutting edge of engineering and who really is transforming medicine. She works at the University of Oxford. She's going to talk to you about some of the incredible work that she's been doing and is turning and translating into therapy. Professor Eleanor Stride.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Jack, for that incredibly powerful look at what we have now and what we will hopefully have in the future. I'm actually going to start by turning the clock back 117 years to 1900. Max Planck had just formulated quantum theory. Hugo de Vries was about to change the face of biology by republishing Mendelian genetics. Sigmund Freud had just published The Interpretation of Dreams. And the average worldwide life expectancy was 31. If you were lucky enough to live in the UK or in the US, you could maybe hope to make it into your 40s. So I have a question for you. What do you think you should have been most afraid of? We have some options. So this is where I'd like you to get out those smartphones and vote. So what do you think the leading cause of death in the US was? Smallpox, TB, cancer, or flu? No cheating. Okay. Has everyone had a chance to vote?
We don't give the address because they have to reach.
Okay, it's sli.do. 2293. So everyone's had a chance. Could we go to the poll, please? Yeah, we have an incredibly well-informed audience. Yes, indeed, it was flu. This was actually before the pandemic that followed the First World War, but even so, 1900, you were far more likely to die of an infectious disease than cancer, or indeed any of the other things that we associate with mortality now. We've come an incredibly long way in the past 100 years. The average life expectancy now is 71 worldwide, and in the developed world, you can easily hope to live into your 80s. That's due to a combination of vaccinations. We've eliminated smallpox. We've massively reduced the incidence of many infectious diseases, at least in the developed world. But the flip side to that is, particularly in those countries where we have extended life expectancy, our chances of dying from cancer, unfortunately, have trebled. This is not for lack of effort. Since the 1930s, there's been an increasingly militant stance against cancer. The idea of a fight against cancer has become incredibly prevalent in the literature, culminating in 1971 with US President Nixon actually declaring war on cancer with the National Cancer Act. And yet, despite goodness knows how many billions that have been spent in developing different types of cures and improving diagnosis, we've just not managed to eliminate it the way we have something like smallpox. Now, to understand why, we need to look a little more closely at exactly what cancer is. At a very, very basic level, something, and I will come back to what that something is, causes the DNA in some of our cells to become corrupted. And that disrupts the way that cells divide. In normal, healthy tissue, cell division is an incredibly regulated and controlled process. It occurs at a fixed rate, and if something goes wrong, if a cell becomes injured in some way, there's a process known as apoptosis, which is a form of programmed cell death. That cell will self-destruct, and the debris will be removed by the immune system. The other healthy cells will continue to divide as if nothing had happened. What happens in cancer is that, unfortunately, that scrambling of the DNA switches off this apoptosis, this programmed cell death. So you get uncontrolled cell division. Cells divide in a completely unrestrained way. They form a mass, which eventually becomes a tumor. These cells continue to proliferate, they don't die, and eventually that tumor unfortunately grows and chokes the surrounding tissue. And if it's in a major organ, it simply shuts it down. Now, it's not that the immune system actually does nothing. Once a cell goes wrong, the immune system should pick it up. It's actually more frightening than that. What happens is the cell forms a sort of chemical Jedi mind trick on the immune system. It persuades it that nothing's wrong. Part of the reason is this isn't a foreign parasite. This isn't a bacterium or a virus that the immune system can detect. These are our own cells that have gone wrong. That's what makes it incredibly difficult to treat. So if our own immune system can't treat the cancer, we need to look to external methods. Unfortunately, that's also extremely difficult, because the way the tumor grows does several things which make it very, very hard to tackle. Another thing I should say is, although I'm going to be talking about a generic tumor for most of the talk, actually there's huge variability between different tumors depending on where they occur, and even between individual patients. Which again, if we develop a cure for one type of cancer, it doesn't necessarily mean it'll be effective elsewhere. Now, these challenges, the first is due to the fact that this tumor is growing so rapidly. We have this unregulated cell division. So instead of the nice structured set of blood vessels that we have feeding normal tissue, the tumor is growing so fast, it needs nutrients, it needs oxygen. It actually recruits blood vessels to itself. Because it's growing so quickly, these vessels also grow very, very quickly, and we get this very strange, chaotic structure being produced. What this looks like, when I finish clicking through, is this. We have this mess of blood vessels, this mesh, and we have regions of the tumor that are very highly vascularized, where the blood vessels are very close together, but then we have these other regions where there are very large distances between them. So when we put drugs into those blood vessels, they don't penetrate very far into the tumor, so a large region will be completely untreated. Similarly, even if our immune cells make it to the tumour and start to work on the cells, again, they can't penetrate this region. The other problem is, as the tumour is developing, it shuts down another part of our circulation, which is our lymphatic system. So in addition to blood feeding our tissues, we also have the lymphatic system that's draining away the excess fluid, and that's a vital part of the immune system. Because this tumour is growing so quickly, it literally crushes these lymphatic vessels, so we no longer have proper drainage of the tissue. And that means that the pressure inside the tumour increases compared to the surrounding tissue, making it even harder for us to get anything into there to treat it. Third problem is oxygen, or rather lack thereof. Again, because of this very chaotic vessel structure, these large distances between the blood vessels, it's very difficult for oxygen to diffuse into the tumour. This is taken from a paper published by my colleague in Oxford. It's actually a little model tumour. Purple and red mean that we have cells that are in a very low oxygen environment. You can see as the tumour is growing, those regions become redder. The centre actually becomes so hypoxic, the oxygen is so level that the cells die. So you have this region of dead cells in the middle, and you have this region of very low oxygen concentration, so-called hypoxic cells, around the edge. Now, the problem with hypoxic cells is they're essentially zombies. They don't respond the way normal cells do. They don't respond to chemotherapy, they don't respond to radiotherapy, they don't respond to immunotherapy. They're almost impossible to kill. And these are the ones that are so difficult when it comes to treating cancer. They're the ones that cause recurrence. And then the fourth problem is that if the tumour is allowed to develop, some of these cells are able to penetrate into the bloodstream, they get into the circulation, and they form secondary tumours elsewhere in the body. Often these are far too small to detect, they grow unnoticed, they can be particularly aggressive, and unfortunately these are the ones that tend to turn out to be fatal. Now, I apologise, I realise this is all quite depressing. It's not all doom and gloom. We do have cancer treatments now, we are able to treat tumours, and if we're successful in catching them early enough, these can be extremely successful. Jack's already shown this. The first recorded incidence of a treatment of cancer actually goes back to 2000 BC. It's an ancient Egyptian papyrus where they describe removing a malignant mass using a hot knife. In the intervening 4,000 years, actually cancer treatment didn't improve a great deal. And it wasn't until the end of the 19th century that it was discovered that radiation could be a very effective alternative for killing tumour cells. The reason it's so attractive compared to surgery is because it's essentially non-invasive. We can treat tumours from outside the body. We don't need to go in and try and remove the mass. And for patients who are quite late-stage cancer, that's a really important consideration. For the first half of the 20th century, really radiation and surgery were the two key options, and they are two of the main pillars of cancer treatment still today. We have, however, added a lot of new ones. Laser surgery, microwave ablation, radiofrequency ablation, high-intensity ultrasound are all now used as means of physically treating cancer cells. We put enough energy into the body to destroy those cells non-invasively, and we're able to treat primary tumours very, very effectively. Provided we can identify the tumour and it hasn't spread, these are extremely effective. The problem with all these physical techniques, though, is making sure that we have actually killed all of the cells, removed them, and that we've not missed any that have spread elsewhere in the body. So the other key development in the 20th century was the advent of chemotherapy, the discovery of drugs that were toxic to tumour cells that could be injected into the body to essentially mop up these remaining cells, which is why normally surgery and or radiotherapy are combined with chemotherapy to produce a more effective treatment. Challenge with chemotherapy, though, is in order to be effective at mopping up these cancer cells, we need to inject it into the circulation. It needs to go throughout the bloodstream in order to catch any remaining cells. So my second question for you is, of an injected dose, the amount that we put into the bloodstream, what proportion do you actually think is taken up at a tumour site? You can vote again. Last chance. May we go to the poll, please? Well, you're either a very, very well-informed or a very cynical audience. You're absolutely right. It's less than 1%. It's a tiny, tiny proportion of the injected dose that will actually make it to the tumour site. The rest, unfortunately, will be absorbed by healthy tissue, and that's why chemotherapy is associated with such horrendous side effects. We have got better. In the last 30 years or so, our ability to develop drugs which are much more targeted towards tumour cells and less toxic to the rest of the body has dramatically improved. Unfortunately, they've also become much more specific, so they're not suitable for a wide range of cancers, but at least our ability to avoid some of the more awful side effects has improved. Probably the most exciting development is the advent of immunotherapy. So now, instead of using a drug that is designed simply to kill the cancer cells, these drugs switch the immune system back on so that normal processes by which disease cells are removed start to occur. And the reason this is so incredibly exciting is, firstly, the side effect profile is much, much better. And secondly, once the immune system's been activated, there's a much, much better chance of finding those cells that are left behind, finding these secondary tumours, treating them, and most importantly, preventing them from coming back. This is probably what's going to change the face of cancer treatment in the next 10 to 20 years. But it's not the whole story. We still need to get these drugs deep into the tumour. We need to get them distributed throughout the tumour to activate the immune cells so that they can do their job. We still have to overcome this chaotic vessel structure, the high internal pressure, the lack of oxygen, and the fact that if we don't, the tumour is going to spread. Why am I standing in the Institute of Engineering and Technology as a mechanical engineer, giving you a talk on essentially the history of medicine and biology, which I'm certainly not qualified to be doing? The reason, as Jack's already alluded to, is I strongly believe that if we do wish to develop effective treatments for cancer, we have to join forces. Not just the medics and the engineers, the economists, government, and as I'll talk a little bit later, town planners, food scientists. We have to start working together in order to develop effective strategies. But what I want to do now is highlight some of the things which have already been developed and are now making it into the clinic. The first is a really beautiful example of how physics and pharmacology can be brought together, so-called photodynamic therapy. This utilizes drugs which only become activated when they're exposed to light. The light causes the molecule to break down and form reactive oxygen species. These are incredibly toxic to cancer cells. They're incredibly toxic to all cells, but because we can do it in a very, very focused way, using a laser, we can produce them in a very small region and hence have a very, very targeted therapy. The fact that 99% of the drug or more is being absorbed by the rest of the body doesn't matter because it's not active. This is being used now clinically, and it's incredibly effective. This is a patient suffering from skin cancer, and as you can see, the tumour's been completely removed. It's being trialled now and in London in UCLH for prostate cancer. It's also being looked at for breast cancer and a number of others. There is one small problem, and it's the reason that photodynamic therapy is primarily being used for skin cancer. I shall demonstrate. If you want to treat something that is a few millimeters deep in the tissue, it is absolutely brilliant. If you want to treat something that's a few centimeters deep in the tissue, it's hopeless, unless you can insert a fiber optic or you have to resort to some sort of invasive procedure. The other disadvantage is that once the drug is in the bloodstream, the patient will be very, very sensitive to light. That drug will become activated whichever part of the body is exposed to light. So they do have to remain in very, very low light conditions for quite a period of time. Compared to conventional chemotherapy, that's a small price to pay, but it is a disadvantage. So a really exciting discovery that was made originally in Japan is that we can use other things to activate these drugs that can penetrate more deeply into the body. And that something is ultrasound. And many of you, I'm sure, have had an ultrasound scan at some point. The reason we use it for imaging inside the body is because it can penetrate several centimeters, and it's incredibly safe. Does anyone know what puts the ultra into ultrasound? Absolutely right. Does anyone want to hazard a guess where that threshold is? Brilliant. I knew someone would know. Or you can look at the diagram. So the textbook says 20 kilohertz. I've been working in ultrasound now for nearly 20 years, and I've grown increasingly skeptical as to exactly where this threshold does lie. So I would like to join me in an experiment. We're going to play a series of sounds at different frequencies, and if you could stick your hand up if you can hear it, that would be brilliant. So to start with, we're going to play 20 hertz. This is 20 vibrations per second, and this is allegedly the lower threshold of human hearing. May we have 20 hertz, please? Excellent, everyone is fully functional. We're now going to speed things up. It's now going to vibrate 200 hertz. Excellent. Could we turn the volume down a little bit for the next? The next one is not so pleasant, I apologize. So 2000 hertz. That's enough of that, thank you. Okay, so now we're going to try 20,000 hertz. Okay, and can we go to the next one up? There we go. Can we have that one again, please? A few people are looking as though you probably heard the little click at the beginning as the tone came on. Yeah. Oh well, so much for the textbooks. Anyway, for what we're using, we're going much, much higher in frequency. We're going up to millions of hertz. The reason we do that is because as we increase the frequency, the wavelength of the sound decreases dramatically. And so we're able to focus as tightly as we can with a laser using sound, but we can do so much, much more deeply in the body. So photodynamic therapy has now become sonodynamic therapy. We simply replaced a laser with an ultrasound beam. We've still not solved our penetration problem, however. We've still got to get that drug accumulating in the tumor. Another area that's been a huge topic of research for the past 20 years is nanotechnology. So the idea here is we actually exploit this incredibly chaotic vessel structure that we have in a tumor. Because another feature of this is because these vessels develop so quickly, the gaps between the cells that line the blood vessels are much larger than they are in healthy tissue. So if we can formulate the drug in the form of a particle that's too large to leak out into healthy tissue, but will escape within the tumor, we should be able to get this sort of preferential uptake of the drug by the cancer cells. Around 250 nanometers is ideal. The pores within a tumor are around 300 nanometers. In healthy tissue, they're around 100. So the idea is we inject the nanoparticles, they flow through, they will leave the bloodstream within a tumor, and the rest will be lost. Because the drug's inside the nanoparticle, there shouldn't be too much toxicity. Next question. Now we have this size selection. What effect do you think that's had on our ability to dose the tumor? Now what proportion of drug can we get? It's not 42. Please vote now. Okay. May we have the results, please? Very, very sorry. It was a bit of a trick question. It was a bit of a trick question. So the hope was very much that it would be at least 10%. This was a paper that came out at the end of last year and has caused a considerable stir in the nanotechnology area. Still less than 1%. The reasons are multiple and various. One of the main ones, though, is this high intratumoral pressure. Because the particles are now larger, it's actually harder for them to diffuse. So even though there's a size selectivity, there's a pressure gradient stopping them from diffusing in. There are a lot of other reasons as well. It's a fantastic paper if you're interested in reading it. But yeah, the short story is it didn't work. So as engineers, is there something we can do to help give the particles a push? Something that gets them across this pressure gradient so we can actually increase their concentration in the tumour? Well, a fantastic way of producing a force within the human body is to use a magnetic field. Penetrates tissue, it's harmless, and it's not impeded by tissue. So these are just some little magnetic particles we have in the lab, and we've simply applied a permanent magnet, and we're able to drag them to a particular location. Dr. Bradley Nelson's group in Zurich have gone a step further. They've used an oscillating magnetic field to help produce these so-called micro-swimmers. So they can actually drive these particles, which can be loaded with drugs, deep into a tumour. These are so-called micro-swimmers, though. These are about the size of a red blood cell. So it's quite difficult to get them very deep into a tumour before they're impeded. The other problem with magnetic targeting is, unfortunately, the force that you can develop from a magnet drops off with the cube of distance. So we do still have a problem with the depth at which this is going to be effective. Some absolutely brilliant chemists, though, have taken this a step further and were quite rightly awarded the Nobel Prize for Chemistry last year by taking this down to the molecular scale, creating so-called molecular machines which, rather than using a magnetic field, use a chemical gradient to induce motion. Admittedly, this is still a field in its infancy, but one of the application areas that they think is particularly promising is the potential to have molecules that can be actively driven into tumours for treatment with chemotherapy. So I think, again, this is something which in the next 10 to 20 years, we're going to see this transforming the way that we think about treating tumours. The third, possibly more intuitive way to produce a force inside the body is, again, to use ultrasound. Ultrasound, any sound wave, is a time-varying pressure. If you have a time-varying pressure, you can set up a gradient which produces a force. And we can exploit that force, again, to help drive drugs deeper into tumours. This is already being trialled. Last year in Paris, and about 6 months before that in Toronto, 2 clinical trials were set up for treating patients with glioblastoma, with a very, very serious form of brain cancer. They are using ultrasound focused in the brain to help increase the permeability of the blood vessels there to enhance the diffusion of chemotherapy drugs. And the results from Paris, which were published earlier this year, are looking incredibly promising. The way they've helped to enhance that effect is to use a highly compressible particle, an ultrasound-responsive particle, to help amplify the effect of the ultrasound in helping this diffusion process. That particle is a little gas bubble. It's about 1/4 of the size of a red blood cell. But despite that, because it is full of gas, it's highly compressible. When it's put in an ultrasound field, it starts to oscillate, and it's these oscillations that drive the diffusion of the drug. These are some high-speed movies taken by myself and my colleague at Imperial College of a bubble oscillating in an ultrasound field. What you can see is it pulsates. These are results we've taken more recently using a little device that we can put under a microscope to visualize the flow around that bubble. The bubble is sitting in the center here. Key thing about this is that although the bubble is only 1/4 of the size of a red blood cell, the flow field that it sets up is 100 times larger. So we've seeded little fluorescent particles into this flow so we can track where they're going. We can push drugs 500 times more than the size of the bubble into tissue. That's under the microscope in the lab. This is in a real tumour. So these are experiments done with my colleagues in Oxford using a special type of nanoparticle that generates a bubble. And we're trying to deliver an antibody. And this first image is what happens if we just inject the drug in the absence of bubble. Tumour cells are blue, the drug is green. The reason you can't see any green in that image is not because the projector's not working, it's because there isn't any. You have to look very, very closely. We see some at the periphery of the tumor where there is a dense mesh of blood vessels. We see a little region here just adjacent to a blood vessel, but deep inside the tumor, nothing, or at least it's not detectable. But when we repeat that experiment with ultrasound, hopefully I don't even need to go to the close-up, there's drug absolutely everywhere. This is the periphery of the tumor, and as you can see, we've managed to push it right into the core. And that's the key to actually achieving successful treatment, is making sure we get the drug to all of the cells. But we're still not there. We've got some approaches to deal with this chaotic vessel structure. We have some ideas for how we can overcome the high internal pressure, but we still have these cells that are unresponsive because they're in low oxygen, and we still have the problem of metastatic spread. Now, one of the reasons I'm so passionate about using bubbles as a delivery vehicle for chemotherapy is because they give us a method to treat low oxygen concentration. We're already delivering something that's full of gas. We can substitute that gas for oxygen so we can deliver the drug with its own payload simultaneously. Now, these are some results that I showed 2 years ago at an earlier IET talk where we just performed these experiments with colleagues at the University of Ulster. The red line here is showing what happens in an untreated tumor. And as you can see, this is an incredibly aggressive form of pancreatic cancer. The tumor grows, it doubles its volume in under a week. And when we treat with just the drug and normal bubbles, we see no effect. When we treat with normal bubbles, but with ultrasound, we do see an initial effect, but unfortunately the tumor very, very quickly recurs. With the oxygen bubbles, we're able to halve the size of that tumor, and it remains there over 5 days. We were incredibly excited about this, but it's fair to say 5 days is not particularly impressive. And another thing about this experiment is that we had to directly inject the bubbles into the tumor. These are in mice, by the way. We're not doing this in humans just yet. But it was a good result. What we've been able to do in the intervening 2 years, and these are results we've just sent for review as a paper, is repeat the experiments, but now injecting the bubbles into the bloodstream and using a magnet to target them to the tumor. And as you can see, we're able to shrink the tumor even more effectively with this approach. And crucially, the graph on the left is showing a marker of this apoptosis that I mentioned earlier, this programmed cell death. So what we're able to see is we are actually switching that back on. We're successfully killing the cancer cells, and we're only seeing that effect where we've managed to target the bubbles and the drug. Again, we're very, very excited. But the first question that I get asked, quite rightly, when is this going to be available? When will I see this in a hospital? Now, I sincerely hope, with regard to the last results I just showed, that's going to be within the next 2 years. That's our target. For a lot of the other things that I've shown you, however, they probably are still in the realms of science fiction, at least for now. We have a lot of barriers. There are still a lot of fundamental scientific questions that remain unanswered about cancer. I mentioned that something goes wrong causing the DNA to get corrupted. I didn't say what that was, for the simple reason we don't know. We know that a lot of things do cause it, smoking being the obvious example. Many, many other causes have been identified and correlated to the incidence of cancer. We still don't understand the fundamental mechanism by which that happens. We don't fully understand how genetic and environmental risk affects this process either. It's pretty well established now that exposure to asbestos, smoking, exposure to certain types of pollution dramatically increase our chances of getting cancer. But I guarantee most people in the room will know somebody, a friend or a relative, who smoked 60 a day, drank like a fish, and lived happily to over 100. It's individual. It depends on who you are and your own genetic profile. We don't understand why cancer becomes drug resistant, not fully. How tumours evade the immune system, and actually why they spread. We know a huge amount. The development of cancer biology as a field has been absolutely extraordinary. I should have counted the number of Nobel Prizes that have been awarded over the past century. It's a lot, and quite unrightly so, but we're not there yet. We're not there yet technically either. We have some promising results in mice on achieving better distribution of drugs. We haven't done this yet in humans. We still have to find more effective ways of targeting metastases. Immunotherapy is looking incredibly promising, but it's astronomically expensive at the moment. The number of people who can afford to be treated with it is vanishingly small, and that isn't going to change anytime soon. We also need better ways of monitoring treatments. It's no good treating somebody, then bring them back 6 months to discover that the tumour has grown. We need much more rapid feedback so that we can intervene promptly. And perhaps the biggest problem is the economics. The cost of drug development is absolutely amazing. I started trying to translate some of the stuff we've been doing in the lab 10 years ago. I'm still stunned by how much it costs and the regulatory framework that you have to go through to make that happen. We need to do something about the cost of manufacturing and how we approach this process. And even once a drug has been approved, the way that different healthcare systems across the world reimburse that drug, the way they pay for it, seriously needs to be reviewed. Because at the moment, it's preventing very, very effective treatments from actually making it to patients. It's not all about treatment. There are other ways through the maze that we need to develop simultaneously. And the first is detection. Why? Because if we can detect a cancer early, even now, with our existing treatments, our chances of a cure, of genuinely achieving remission, are dramatically increased. Particularly for prostate cancer, for breast cancer, ones where there's been a huge effort to develop treatments, we do now have a very, very good chance of succeeding. The problem is, we often don't catch it until we're in the later stages. Now, we could give all patients an MRI scan or a CT scan every year. That would probably give us a very good chance of picking up cancer early. It's impossible. It's prohibitively expensive, and the risk of the radiation exposure will probably outweigh the benefit. We need low-cost, effective imaging techniques that we can apply to everybody regularly. One really exciting development is so-called lab-on-a-chip technology. So this is where taking a simple blood or saliva sample, we can look for markers of cancer that are present in the bloodstream before a tumour, or certainly before a detectable tumour, has started to develop, so that we can intervene and hopefully be successful. And all of that comes with raising public awareness. One of the reasons why breast cancer now is less likely to be a death sentence is because people are aware of it. Women regularly check. GPs regularly check. It's something people know may happen and that they need to catch it early. We need to make that the case for every type of cancer. And then finally, prevention. It's not going to be the whole story, but it's a big part of it. One of the reasons that we were able to eliminate infectious diseases in the first part of the 20th century, yes, vaccination, but a huge part of it was actually cleaning up the water supply, improving food hygiene, understanding the disease better. And there's a lot we can do to help prevent cancer as well. Unfortunately, it involves all of these things, and it's proving extremely difficult to get that message across. And again, I think the basic scientific understanding is needed so that people will genuinely be convinced that these are good things. And again, it's not just about doctors telling you to get out and exercise and stop drinking. We need architects, civil engineers, town planners, farmers, food producers to think carefully about what materials we're using, what pollutants we're putting into the environment, all of which are known to potentially cause cancer. There needs to be a massive concerted effort if we're going to achieve an effective treatment and hopefully a reduction in the incidence of this disease altogether. But finally, if the history of science teaches us anything, it's not the things that we're currently working on that are likely to change the world. It's actually the route through the maze that we haven't thought of yet. And on that note, I'd like to thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Eleanor. Truly fascinating insight into your work. Really amazing. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take some questions from the audience now. Jack, if you'd like to join us back up on the stage, that'd be brilliant. Let's have another round of applause for our two speakers today. One of the things we've got today, if you see on this, we've got a fantastic new device here, which is we're going to try out today. It's called a catch box. It is actually a microphone. It's fantastic technology. It has an accelerometer inside, I believe, I got that right. And so when it lands, the actual microphone turns on. When you chuck it, it turns off so we don't hear the thud. We're going to try it with Simon first, just to make sure it works. There we go. Say hello, Mark.
Hello, Mark.
It all works beautifully. So if you stick your hand up, we'll take a question from you. Wait until the box arrives. We do need to wait for the box because we're live going out on stream today and also recording for later viewing. And without the microphone, we won't hear your question. If you have a question for one in particular of the speakers, please say their name in the question, then we'll know who it's for. If not, I'll try and work out who it should go to. So have we got any first takers for a question here? Gentleman over there, Simon, I think he had his hand up first. Right around this side on the end there.
Sorry.
Oh, we're just getting some more. Here we go. They've been practicing all day today. That's it. The sort of round thing on the top. That's perfect.
Two quick questions. Can you comment on the use of engineered viruses and bacteria? And secondly, a comment on heritability of cancer. Finished.
Can I do the first one? Yes, unfortunately I didn't have time to list all the amazing things that have been developed. Engineered viruses is an absolutely fascinating one. For those in the audience who haven't heard of these are viruses that have been genetically engineered so that they will only destroy tumors. The problem with them, again, is delivery. So the idea is that if you can get them partially into the tumor, they will replicate, and therefore you don't need to worry about the fact that you only have got a few in there. The problem is, because you have this incredibly dense tissue within a tumor, it's actually still very difficult for them to penetrate far enough. So it's a brilliant technology, and again, I think I'd lump it in with immunotherapy, but we still have these delivery issues to overcome. Heredity is all yours, Jack.
Cheers. Well, I'm an extremely underqualified person, seeing as I'm not an oncologist and I'm not a geneticist, but I'll give it a go. I think the main issue is that there's a big drive at the moment with even consumer-type genomics to see whether a lot of the traits that might lead to a particular disease are going to affect me. The same goes for cancer. So far, apart from some very big things which might run in families like Lynch syndrome, or some really big Mendelian, mutations, and cancer is basically a part of the spectrum of growth and repair. It's an extreme of a normal process, and that's what makes it so incredibly difficult. We start off as one cell, inheriting two halves of each of our parents' chromosomes, and we become a bloody big tumor in 9 months. Growth is an incredibly essential thing to, life. For instance, there's one little gene complex that I know about called Lin28, which also, I think, pairs up with a thing called MIC7? I think so. Who's a geneticist here? Anyway, they both work together. Lin28, if you turn it off, some amazing work being done at Harvard in this, where they genetically engineer mice to replace Lin28 with something that can turn on or off Lin28 in the presence of an antibiotic in the bloodstream. Super cool. if you turn off Lin-28, you stay as one cell and you don't go anywhere. You turn on Lin-28, you become a mouse. Well, if you're a mouse. And you overexpress it, and tumours everywhere. 15% of tumours have Lin-28 turned on. It's not just about defects in pathways. It's about things that are normal, just not behaving themselves in a normal way. And I think that's a marvelous engineering challenge that we've got. It's the perfect engineering challenge, in fact, as opposed to a lot of the other inherited diseases that we can actually go to the very, very root cause of it, tie up some loose ends, and you live for a long time without getting that particular disease. Cancer's not like that.
Super. So a question there in the middle, just while we're passing the catch box round. Can I just say, is it difficult to make these bubbles? I mean, I find it hard making bubbles for my children. If you've got a tiny bubble this small, that's an engineering masterpiece, surely?
It is. It's extremely easy to manufacture bubbles. It's extremely difficult to manufacture them well. So the quick and dirty way of making bubbles, which is actually the industry standard, is very similar to a cappuccino machine. We take whatever we want on the surface of the bubble, we blow gas that we want inside the bubble through the liquid, and we shake it very, very hard. We actually use ultrasound to shake it very, very hard. It's great, but we have zero control over the size of the bubbles, and if we're trying to incorporate a drug, it's useless because we can't control how much drug is ending up in each bubble. The alternative, unfortunately, is to use microfluidic technology, where we are blowing bubbles one by one. Just as you blow bubbles for your 3-year-old, we're doing that, they're just really, really tiny. The problem with that is we need a bubble wand that is of the same size as the bubbles we want to produce, which means it's very, very slow, and it's a nightmare because dust is actually larger than the bubbles we're trying to make. So we have to do this in a very, very clean environment, or except we're going to have to throw away one of these chips every 5 minutes. So one of the things we're working on is to try and produce a hybrid of these so that we can produce very, very big bubbles in a very controlled way, because we can do that quickly, and then use ultrasound to break them up so that we have very, very tiny bubbles at a high yield, but with a controlled size.
Glad I asked.
I think the microphone's made it.
Brilliant. Your question, sir.
Hi, a question for Eleanor. What exactly is meant by the precancerous cells? Like solar keratomas and things like that, that are not really considered as cancer, but they can develop into cancer.
I think that's probably also one for Jack. It's very difficult to define. That's part of the problem. It isn't that we've picked up a virus or a bacterium that's foreign. Mutations occur in the cell, and to begin with, they can be very, very small mutations, and the cell doesn't start forming a very aggressive tumor quickly. Small defects starts expressing proteins, other pathways get activated, and eventually that leads to cancer. But there isn't this very clear break in the development process where, yep, now it's cancer. It maybe have been going on for 15 years before. That's why it's so important to have these very sensitive techniques for picking up these markers of cancer before a tumor develops. But I think it's fair to say we don't fully understand it either.
And this is also what is meant by low-grade cancers, which they say, well, it isn't worth treating because you'll die before the cancer actually kills you.
Yeah, exactly. Again, as I said, there's a huge variability in different types of tumours. Some tumours will grow very, very slowly, and it's probably likely to do more damage if we intervene. It's the aggressive ones that we need to think about treating.
Any more questions? Question down here in the front row, second row back. No, somebody's going to throw it. Oh, I thought we were actually going to get a throw there. It was a risky moment.
Yes, my question is, what is engineering doing now, and what does it need to in the future to lower the cost of treatment?
If I knew that, I'd probably be trying to make it happen. The problem is it's across all areas. So the cost of manufacturing a lot of the chemicals is incredibly expensive. At the risk of seriously offending many of my friends in the pharmaceutical industry, the approach for the last 20 years has been, let's manufacture as many compounds as we can, test them all, and see which one seems to be effective. sounds like a great idea, but once you realize just how many combinations and permutations there are, it was never going to work, even with supercomputers and massive, massive laboratories. So I think becoming smarter, more selective about how we identify compounds that might work is really crucial. That's the more computer science end of things, chemical engineering, but then we also need chemical engineers to work on the fabrication processes, make those cheaper. But a lot of it is also to do with the regulatory framework and the way we design and test these things. The fact that it takes 10 years and $10 million to get a new product anywhere near a viable test means you've got to pick winners, and very often we don't.
I was just going to say you're lucky, Eleanor, because you're not a medical doctor, so you can't get struck off whilst what I'm about to say.
I just don't get funding.
So, to be candid, we are stuck in a very primitive, I would say, by current standards, way of developing these therapies and testing them on individuals. Once we actually get them to market, we hardly really test them at all. A lot of the cost is because of the inefficiency. The fact that it doesn't work means that in a lot of cases means that drugs don't get the kind of tariffs that they deserve, and we end up inflating everything as people try to, claim an extra $100,000 a year for a drug because it's got a 5% difference, there's a lot of waste there. And I think if there was an approach like bug fixing each and every piece of software, you would bug fix every piece of software on an individual basis, not kind of a long time ago sort of say, well, if we write code like this, we'll generally have less bugs. So let's give code to everybody like this, and just hope and see after 6 months or a year whether the problems come back. We haven't yet developed a really good platform for once a drug is marketed and once it's out there, or a technique in a drug in a combination, to monitor on a day-by-day basis whether it's actually working or not, to remove the waste if it isn't working, and then to say, damn, people like this, this, and this, if we give them that and that in that combination, they do better. So let's give that drug company more money. We don't do that. The entire framework, which is good science, is have one variable, test it against a control, do it over however many people, gain statistical significance. It has to run for many years in cancer because the end outcome is what? Usually survival. So at very least, it's 5-year outcomes. We're stuck, and I think that aviation, a lot of different really successful industries, information technology industry. They've all taken a view that science provides us with some kind of direction, but in the individual case, an engineering approach gives us that individual solution, which provides more data for when you're going to go and give it to the next person. And I think fundamentally we need to reduce the cost of the development by adopting a new, rapidly iterative type of approach to testing once it's out in market.
Chap just there behind, so if you throw it straight behind, yep, perfect.
So it sounds like we need an interdisciplinary approach to this problem, and everybody knows that at a rhetorical level, the funding agencies are all gung-ho for interdisciplinarity. It's a catchphrase. In my limited experience, it's very, very difficult to organize. And there are spin-off things that nobody thinks about, like if you have 5 disciplines coming together to work on a problem, which journal do you publish in? Those kind of things that may seem funny, but they're life and death, right? Do you see any sign of change in this? Can we make interdisciplinarity a kind of essential ingredient of research funding?
Yes, and I think that's one thing which in this country and across the world, actually, it has changed. And I think the markers of success for me as an academic, it's no longer how many papers did you publish last year. It is, yes, did you publish some papers last year? Have you translated this? What is the impact of your research? And I think that has changed, and I think it's a very, very positive change. Interdisciplinarity, I think the definition of that has also changed. I think it needs to change more. When I started, a mechanical engineer working with a civil engineer was a massive breach of protocol. That was true interdisciplinarity. Similarly, an oncologist working with a pharmacologist was interdisciplinarity. Now it's a mechanical engineer working with a clinician. It needs to be a mechanical engineer working with a clinician, working with a pharmacologist, working with a drug company, working with an economist, working with a politician. So I think we've come a long way. We've got a lot further to go.
And is that something that you found, because your team is made up of lots of different disciplines, I assume, and is that why you're getting good results with the kind of the small-scale treatments you're doing?
Well, I mean, when we're looking after people, the multidisciplinary teams that we have are actually quite focused around physiology and sports science, effectively. So we but yes, we do have. If we have a cancer patient, we'll either have, the oncologist will always be there, for instance. But this isn't research. This is actually treating people. We will have the main oncologist working with someone who is interested in supporting the immune system, someone that's looking at metabolic pathways, someone that's looking at sort of traditional chemo, radio, and that kind of stuff, together with people that look at diet, nutrition, physiology, that's fitness, essentially, sleep and recovery, and kind of mental state. Basically, all the stuff you do for an athlete if you want to get them ready for, punching Klitschko, you'd have the same team around a cancer patient as well. But I think so that's clinical. That's actually clinically treating somebody. I think in terms of research, which is what the question was there, that's a different story. Yes, you need a bit of those elements, but I think you need to break down barriers that really have never been broken down before, to really get the research being interdisciplinary. And where I'm seeing that happen more and more is in places like California, where actually the traditional structures and competition that exists within different people that are trying to publish in different papers from different from the same funding pots. The guys that are funding this, or the people that are funding this, don't care. They have made billions and billions and billions of dollars. They want to live for a very long time, and they don't want to get cancer. So they're saying, let's get the best computer scientists, the best engineers, the best, you name it, and let's get them in a room, and it's a moonshot, but let's crack cancer. And my feeling is that some of that wacky West Coast spirit is slowly percolating east. It's taking a bit of a while. It's going to have to swim far to get over the pond. But it's getting there. It's happening. The seeds are really beginning. The Zuckerberg Foundation, Sean Parker's fund, all the guys that have, exited their tech companies, now realizing that life is worth more than money.
Question 2 along, and then we'll throw it back around and come over here. So that's perfect.
Thank you. Can you give any idea of the sort of the timeline when some of these rather exciting things might become, should we say, generally available? And sort of second part to that, what are the major roadblocks along that timeline?
It depends. I think, some of what I've shown is already available. The barriers there are simply cost and, I don't want to say publicity, but that is sort of what I mean, getting clinicians to hear about success in one area and getting them to try it. I think those are the two challenges with what we have now. What we're working on, where we're using existing drugs, we're just trying to deliver them more effectively. I say we're aiming at doing this within the next 2 to 5 years. My colleagues in Oxford are hoping to run a trial next year. And the sonodynamic therapy that I showed you, we're aiming at 2 years for that. The more science fiction things, the molecular machines, I think we're probably looking at 20 years because there's still a lot of scientific challenges to overcome before you even get anywhere near the regulatory process. So I think there's a huge spectrum. But yeah, the main barrier for a lot of them is just simply money. It costs far too much currently to get something into a clinical trial.
Shall we pass it back a couple of places, and then there's a question right back at the sort of 4 rows from the back, and we'll throw it over that way straight after you, sir.
Right. I thought the interdisciplinary approach, particularly in this country, one example of that I thought was probably Sir Paul Nurse in the Crook Institute, because I thought he was pretty keen on trying to get people from lots of different sort of disciplines to try and crack some of these things. Mm-hmm. So that was just referring back to that last question. The other thing I was going to say is, where does stem cell therapy fit into all this?
You want something that's really expensive. I think, again, the challenge there is because it is very, very specific to a patient, and it is currently extraordinarily expensive to isolate, engineer, re-administer stem cells. That's what's causing it to be seriously hindered in its development. And at the moment, I'm not sure we've got a plan for how we're going to reduce those costs. That's the real problem. I don't know. Do you have more thoughts on stem cells?
On stem cells? Stem cell therapy is perhaps a little bit more geared towards regenerative
well, that's
stuff.
what I wasn't quite clear about.
Yeah, I mean, it is being looked at. It has been looked at as a cancer treatment. It's probably less mainstream. Again, it kind of wraps into immunotherapy to some extent, but yeah, it's more for, I think, neurodegeneration, for musculoskeletal disease.
I mean, as we live longer, we're either going to have to find a way of effectively breaking the barrier which nature has set for us in terms of the number of times a cell can actually replicate. It's about 50 cycles at the moment, which kind of puts an ultimate cap on our life of about 120 years. I think people who are trying to break that barrier for reasons good or naive will need to find a way of replacing bits that you can't, just keep going. And some of that will be surgical, and some of that will be biological, and stem cell, biology is part of that. But yeah, I think there's not as much emphasis in the world of cancer on stem cell therapy as there is in immunotherapies and metabolic therapies and targeted nanodelivery, or the kind of stuff that Eleanor's working on in terms of the cytotoxic chemotherapies. And of course, there's all the other super Star Warsy stuff like proton beams and things that are all coming as well. You guys invented that, not us.
Okay, thanks. Where am I throwing this?
It's going right over to sort of, it's the chap in blue. If you can pass it then, perfect.
Confusingly, there are cancer stem cells as well, I should say, which is a whole other area of research that...
Are you studying information emerging from high-energy particle colliders, which are giving us atomic structure of cells?
Do you mean radiopharmaceuticals?
Well, yes, I believe that you do send samples to various synchrotrons for analysis.
So in terms of the effects of radiation in causing cancer, there is a huge amount of research, but also in addition to radiotherapy using an external beam from the body, there is a lot of work going on producing drugs that are themselves radioactive, so that you are producing the radiation inside the tumour so that you have a more localized effect. And that's, again, another very exciting therapeutic that's being developed. Same problem, you still have to deliver it effectively.
Is that someone behind you there? Perfect. And then we'll come over this way. Brilliant.
I think we'd agree the immune system is something we don't know all that much about, and you've touched upon immunotherapy, but there's a lot of work, I believe, in understanding the immune system for reasons other than oncology. How much is this being brought together?
A huge amount. I mean, I think immunotherapy has caught both the research and the commercial world, it's set it alight, and I think everyone who knows anything about immunology is trying to develop an immunotherapy, not just for cancer. Immunotherapy is used for many other diseases as well. Certainly there are several multidisciplinary institutes who are trying to do precisely that. I think, again, there are a lot of fundamental scientific questions as to how the immune system works that need to be looked into. Not to strike too negative a note, but I also think we need to look very, very carefully at what the side effects to the immune system are going to be of these therapies as well, because they're not going to be completely absent. So there is more understanding. But yeah, I think if there was an area where there's been a lot of research effort, it's definitely in immunology.
So there was a question over here, wasn't there?
These guys have got it.
Oh, it's coming on Twitter. Brilliant.
Yes. So we have a question on Twitter from past IET President Naomi Clymer. She asks, question for Jack. How realistic is it to hope that future medical advances will be available to all rather than just the rich?
Future medical advances?
Yep.
So that's a broad one. Thanks, past President. Yeah, it's... So personally, I think the biggest thing that I worry about in general, in terms of global health, is actually the ever-growing divide there is between people who've got stuff and people who haven't. And by that I mean not just money, but also information, access, and support. That gap I don't see shrinking anytime soon. You know, and innovation, paradoxically, requires there to be a lot of money about from some, you know, wealthier sources in order to make it worth doing something. The system's kind of set up to require a differential in inequality. This probably should be a lecture that we give at the London School of Economics or something rather than here, but I don't know if it's a problem for medicine. I think, in general, we have to strive towards things which help to close that gap. Because, you know, for me, eventually it's pitchforks at dawn if some people are living till 100 really, really healthily, whilst there's another bunch of people who can't work past the age of 65 because they're weathered and, you know, their bodies are not able to work well, maybe because they haven't, you know, had even the access or the ability to pay for decent food. I mean, one of the things that I'm allowed to rant a little bit. So, have a look at some of the maps in the UK about the number of food banks that there were in the last 20 years, how they've increased in number from a handful 15, 20 years ago to dozens and dozens and dozens in every single county. There are people where we say, yeah, you've got to do diet, you know, improve your diet, improve your exercise. There are 1 million households today in the UK that rely on food banks to feed themselves and their kids. 1 million. None of us need to go to food banks. We are completely blind to this fact. Do you know what gets sold in food banks? Not sold, what gets given out in food banks? Stuff you don't have to cook. Why? Because people can't afford to turn on the gas to cook this stuff. You know, we're in a very, very privileged position here to be talking about living healthily to 100, to be beating cancer. There are people that are worried about how they're going to feed their kids. And so my view is one of the first steps we need to do is reduce the catastrophic waste in our spending in developed countries on avoidable and early treatable diseases. The cost of preventable hospitalization in the US, for instance, exceeds about $1 trillion a year. That can go to better stuff. So I think we've got some fairly major things to think about before we even consider equality for the kinds of medical advances that we've been talking about today. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it. It doesn't mean you shouldn't have space programs. It doesn't mean you shouldn't have synchrotrons and particle colliders. But we've just got to be a little bit more aware of it than we are at the moment.
I do think there's a very strong need for a change in engineering education as well on that, I think we're very good at developing incredibly high-tech solutions, and I agree we shouldn't stop doing that. But when we're training young engineers, we should make the ultimate economics or whatever they're producing something they think about earlier. I think that's actually really important.
Hello, I've got two questions. First one is, we hear all about the obstructions and the challenges that you... Did we try to reach much wider support from the society, engineering society, using brainstorm sessions like Delphi? I know NASA used this a few years when one of I think Challenger, when crashed, they end up, don't know what is going on, and they reach to the society and they ask, guys, please come with any ideas, whatever, how crazy they are, help, probably we can find a solution together. This is my first question. Second question is, we have lovely technologies, existing technologies at the moment. Did we try to use something, probably you're aware of this, like barometric cameras to equalize the pressure in the body to deliver the medicine to the tumor cell?
Yes, so barometric chambers have been used extensively, actually more for trying to achieve higher oxygen concentrations in tumours. So there were a lot of trials done with radiation therapy where patients were placed in high pressure chambers with a high concentration of oxygen, and they did improve the tissue oxygenation, and there were, the data are a little bit contentious, but I think most people agree that there was an improvement in outcome. The problem is, putting every patient into a barometric chamber is actually quite expensive. It's very impractical. And the side effects are not negligible. Oxygen is actually really toxic stuff. You don't want it in high concentration throughout the body. You want to deliver it directly. I don't know a huge amount about high pressure for other aspects of cancer. I'll turn to my altitude junkie friend here.
Yeah, altitude's great if you survive it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the body's not evolved to deal with it, so I think probably the side effects outweigh. I'm sorry, your first question on societal...
Creating communities and getting brainstorm sessions with larger
society, if we can, to ask for any ideas or...
Absolutely. I think the more people we can get engaged with science and being creative, the better. And I think we just need to separate science from being something that very, very, very clever people do in their labs on their own, and making it something that everyone is interested in and everyone can contribute to. That's vital.
Don't let the medical community own this. Yeah, I mean, own it. There are the geeks out there in California, and also the guys right next to the Crick Institute at DeepMind. They're saying, well, you guys are too slow. We're gonna crack general artificial intelligence on our own. We're not going to do it in a university. We're just going to do it. And they're working on cancer, understanding how cells actually, at a very, very fundamental level, age and misbehave, is stuff that they're working on. And there are moonshot projects like the Cancer Moonshot Project, for instance, in the States, that's had an astonishing amount of money thrown at it by government in the US, encouraging people to get together. But I think waiting for the incumbent to make the move, waiting for the medical profession, who are already, time constrained and have this structure of how you do things, waiting for them to change, it ain't going to happen at the speed of light. It's going to happen at the speed of enlightenment, and that's bloody slow.
I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, that really is all we've got time for this evening. I know we could have lots more questions, so thank you very much. I'd just like to say, before we go this evening, a really big thanks to everybody who made the first Eng Talks look fantastic. All the technical come together, so the events team at the IET and everybody else who helped, and most importantly to our two fantastic speakers this evening. So a big round of applause to Eleanor and Jack. So, ladies and gentlemen, there's now a drinks reception outside where you first came in today, and there's a technology showcase going on, which has got some fantastic exhibitions out there. We've got some brilliant things to look at, so please do go and have a drink and have a walk around and have a look. Don't forget, also in October, we've got our next Eng talk, which is our President's Address. So don't miss that. All the dates and information about it will be on the website, and you can and go and find out details there and book soon. So, ladies and gentlemen,
Smile, everyone. Awesome.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Have a safe journey home, and in the words of Crime Watch, don't have nightmares, okay? Thank you very much.
That don't kill me, can only make me stronger. I need